Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Today on Clearer Than Truth, we're joined by one of the most influential and provocative voices in American foreign policy, Max Boot. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a columnist for the Washington Post, and the author of several acclaimed books, including On Reagan and The Road Not Taken. Over the years, Max has been a leading commentator on America's role in the world, from the failures of interventionism to the rise of authoritarian regimes, and his evolving perspective offers a fascinating window in how U.S. foreign policy thinking has shifted in the 21st century. Max, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
In your recent pieces on Trump's dealings with Putin and the Alaska summit, you describe a pattern of the president being manipulated by Moscow. How does that behavior compare to Ronald Reagan's approach to the Soviets? What does it tell us about how far today's GOP has drifted from Reagan's foreign policy instincts?
I mean, there are some continuities between Reagan and Trump. It's not a completely diametrically opposed vision, but certainly I would argue the differences are greater than the similarities. And of course, you just hit on one of the big differences, because it's hard to imagine Ronald Reagan suffering from the kind of moral confusion that Donald Trump suffers from regarding Russian imperialism. Reagan was very forthright and outspoken in condemning what he called the evil empire and predicting that communism would be consigned to the ash heap of history. Now, when it actually came to his policies, as I show in my biography, the policies were actually much more nuanced, and he was actually much more pragmatic. And when he had a Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, that he could deal with, he was willing to reach out the hand of friendship. But Putin is no Gorbachev. I mean, Putin is probably the worst Russian leader since Stalin. I mean, he has basically recreated the complete dictatorship that ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, he's gone and invaded Ukraine, something that the Soviet Union last did in 1979 when they invaded Afghanistan. And of course, Ronald Reagan was very clear-eyed in calling out Soviet aggression and giving aid to the victims of Soviet aggression. It was actually Jimmy Carter who started aid to the Afghan Mujahideen, but the Reagan administration substantially ramped that up. And so, it's hard to imagine if Ronald Reagan were president that he would be acting in the way that Donald Trump is, where Trump often seems to echo Russian talking points. He frequently blames the Ukrainians, President Zelensky in particular, and President Biden for the invasion of Ukraine instead of blaming the person who actually carried it out, which is Putin. And now Trump has basically ended almost all U.S. aid to Ukraine and essentially leaving the Europeans to support Ukraine on their own. So this is certainly not your father's Republican Party. This is not the Republican Party I grew up with in the 1980s, when I thrilled to Reagan's moral clarity regarding Soviet expansionism. Now there is, complete moral myopia and confusion regarding the threat that dictatorships like Putin's pose to the West.
I guess I would ask, in terms of a comparison with Reagan, about an axis that we may not think of Trump immediately about, which is his kind of passionate belief that he can sort of extinguish the significance of nuclear weapons in international affairs. And I ask about this in part because I think some people, claim that President Trump, sort of credibly deterred Russia from invading Ukraine in his first term. And I wonder if there's validity to that, argument. And also, do you think that there might be just sort of nuance discovered once, we have an archival record of President Trump's administration for this, dualism that we might see in how he, adopts on the one hand, what might appear to be an olive branch approach with President Putin, while at the same time, giving quite a bit of bluster to the arguments around Golden Dome and these kinds of things, or do you think that he sort of speaks for himself in public? What do you think of those things?
I mean, there's a number of threads to unpack in what you just said. I mean, I know that Trump often claims that Putin would never have invaded Ukraine if he were president. I think that remains at best an unproven assertion, um, because the reality is Putin was invading Ukraine when Trump was president. Remember, the Russian invasion of Ukraine did not start in 2022. It actually started in 2014. That was when Russia seized Crimea and launched a proxy war in the Donbass region. And of course, Trump was not standing up to Putin. He was trying to blackmail President Zelensky into providing political dirt on Joe Biden. And of course, now the Trump argument that Putin would have never dared to invade Ukraine if he were president is sort of being put to the test, because what's happened during the Trump administration, has Putin scaled down or stopped the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Far from it. Actually, if you look at the rate of Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities with missiles and drones, it's actually increased dramatically under Trump. It's roughly doubled over the course of the last year. So I don't see a lot of evidence that Trump is actually deterring Putin from anything, or at least certainly no more so than any previous president has done. And of course, a big part of the reason why Putin is invading Ukraine and not Poland or the Baltic republics is because Poland and the Baltic republics are in NATO and Ukraine is not. And ultimately, I think at the end of the day, the only guarantee of Ukrainian security is NATO membership and U.S. peacekeeping troops on Ukrainian soil, as they were in West Germany, as they still are in South Korea. And that's something that Trump has ruled out. And he's basically applying all his pressure against Ukraine and not against Russia. That's not the way to get to peace, because Russia is the aggressor. And I don't know what Putin thinks about Golden Dome, but I doubt it's much of a deterrence to him, because I don't think it's going to work. It's certainly not going to provide this, perfect coverage of the American homeland, which is basically impossible. And although, it's true that defensive capabilities have advanced since President Reagan announced SDI in 1983, it's also true that offensive capabilities have advanced. And now you see hypersonic missiles, you see drones, you see the possibility of true space weapons. So there's all sorts of things going on against cruise missiles also, against which Golden Dome is not going to provide a very effective defense. And at the end of the day, we have the land-based interceptors in Alaska and Hawaii. And as the recent movie A House of Dynamite illustrates, that's like a 50-50 shot in terms of whether they're actually going to intercept the missile or not. And those are not great odds if you're facing the prospect of nuclear attack.
What is President Trump's end game? Why does he want to play footsie with Russia? And why does he, in your words, lack the moral clarity that Reagan had?
Those are good questions to which it's hard to provide definitive answers. I mean, I think there are two basic things going on. One is President Trump has made it very clear he wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize. I've never seen anybody campaigning for a Nobel Peace Prize the way he has been. He claims to have ended 8 or 9 wars, even though a few of those have actually restarted since he claims to have ended them. But obviously, he regards peace in Ukraine as the pièce de résistance of his campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he desperately wants to win that trinket. I mean, the other thing that's going on, I think, is that the Russians are dangling all sorts of investment opportunities in front of the Americans. And that's why it's very interesting to see who the chief Russian interlocutor has been with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. It's Kirill Dmitriev, who is not the foreign minister of Russia. He is the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Russia. And he's clearly suggesting that if only, President Trump would get over his, the history of U.S. support for Ukraine, if you basically sell out Ukraine, force Ukraine to surrender in the war, lift the sanctions, and all of a sudden Russia and the United States can do all sorts of beautiful business together. And there are all these massive and frankly overhyped business opportunities. And the Wall Street Journal also had a piece about how, Donald Trump Jr., Kushner, and a lot of other people in Trump's circuit are actually pursuing their own potential business opportunities with Russia. So I think those are the twin imperatives. But I mean, that is just a very, historically speaking, a very bizarre and alien mindset for a U.S. leader to have, because Ronald Reagan was much more in the traditional mode of U.S. leaders since World War II, who valued the transatlantic alliance, believed in standing up against Soviet imperialism, and believed in backing the democracies of Europe. And those are not impulses that President Trump displays.
Well, I want to jump in here because, I've spent quite a few years kind of studying the 1980s and the conduct around President Reagan's sort of outreach to the Soviet Union, as well as how he was perceived at the time. Just to pick up on the nuclear threat one more time, I mean, the man was depicted as a cowboy riding a missile, constantly in all of these sort of political cartoons because of his perceived sort of, radical suggestions about what the U.S. might do, in the event that Russia didn't cooperate. But, I'm particularly sort of perturbed by depictions of Gorbachev himself because, in the kind of background now, we know that he was lying about implementation of the INF treaty. We know that he was doing all sorts of sort of nasty double dealings, putting down attempts to have the Soviet Union become more free at its extremities. And so I wonder, do you think that sort of, Reagan may benefit in hindsight from sort of, kind of dappled glow around his Soviet interlocutors? Are we giving them too much credit? Might there be more similarities between them and President Putin than might immediately be obvious? Or
well, I think there's two points to address. One is Reagan's views on nuclear weapons, and two, Gorbachev's record. Now, I'll start off with nuclear weapons. I mean, I agree with the gist of what I think you're saying, which is that Reagan in the early 80s in particular was misconstrued as a trigger-happy warmonger. And I think what people didn't realize was he actually wanted to abolish nuclear weapons. That wasn't something he talked about a lot in public, but that was clearly one of his deeply held convictions. And he was appalled by the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. And throughout his first term, even as he was raising defense spending, confronting the Soviets, launching SDI, doing all these other things, he was trying to reach out to the Kremlin because he wanted to establish lines of communication. And he was stymied because, as he said, I want to meet with a Soviet leader, but they keep dying on me. And that he finally found an interlocutor for peace in the Soviet Union when Konstantin Chernenko kicked the bucket and Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union in early 1985. And I think Gorbachev was really a black swan because he was somebody who rose to the top of a dictatorial system and lost faith in that system. He wanted to reform the Soviet Union. He didn't want to break it up. He didn't want to end communism, but he wanted basically communism with a human face, what the Prague Spring was trying to achieve in 1968. And so the reforms that he set in motion, Glasnost and Perestroika, ultimately wound up unraveling the Soviet Union because what the death knell for the Soviet Union was really what used to be known as the nationalities problem, the fact that you had all these different nationalities, whether it was Kazakhs or Ukrainians or Balts or whoever, who didn't want to be part of this Soviet empire. And when Gorbachev made clear that he was not going to use force to keep the empire together, that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, making a very different decision from the one that the communist leaders made in 1989 when they sent tanks to Tiananmen Square to repress this uprising. And so I think at the end of the day, it really was Gorbachev's impetus that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think if a different, more hardline leader had been chosen by the Politburo in 1985, the Soviet Union could very well still exist, as Cuba still exists, North Korea, China, all these other, Vietnam, all these other communist regimes still exist. So I don't think that Reagan defeated the Soviet Union. I don't think he led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what he did do was this is really a tribute to his pragmatism, that he understood that Mikhail Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader. And the turning point of the Cold War was really the Geneva summit in November of 1985, when Gorbachev and Reagan met for the first time, and they both came in with negative preconceptions, with Gorbachev, as he later wrote, thinking of Reagan as the world's number one capitalist, Reagan thinking of Gorbachev as the number one communist. But when they spent a couple of days together, they both understood that they actually wanted the best for their country. They were both afraid of nuclear war. They both wanted to end the arms race, which they thought was a waste of time and money. And so they were able to see eye to eye. And I think Reagan should get tremendous credit for history, not for forcing the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but for befriending Gorbachev and supporting him against his internal challenges. And ultimately, that was what led to the end of the Cold War. And unfortunately, I just don't think that Putin can be talked about in the same breath as Gorbachev, because Gorbachev was a great liberalizing leader. He opposed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and he finally ended it during his time at the top. He wanted to end the arms race, and he did. He reduced armaments. He brought, the United States and the Soviet Union closer together. All the opposite of what Putin is doing, because Putin is animated, as he's often said, by a desire to recreate the Soviet Empire or the Russian Empire, however you want to look at it. That's what he's called the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the great tragedy of the 20th century, and that he's trying to undo that with pursuing the most bellicose policy against the United States of any Russian leader since Khrushchev, and also creating the worst terror and police state in Russia of any Russian leader since Stalin.
Right. I really desperately want to believe you, and I want to believe this narrative about Gorbachev. I will say that when I was in graduate school, you encouraged me to continue going to the National Archives at Kew Gardens. And, just recently they announced that the documents pertaining to the early 2000s, when Tony Blair was, singing Blueberry Hill with Putin on stage and so on, are going to be released. And so I wonder whether, we'll get a sense of how Putin's image in the West transformed from, as you say, this liberal, interested in peace, to the tyrant, whereas, Gorbachev, the sort of, child of Anatoly, went from being perceived as a hardliner to being a liberal. I don't know. I mean, these things change with time, and I wonder about that. But I'll stop there.
I think they changed based on the actions of those leaders. I mean, I think Gorbachev showed that he was a liberalizer because he ultimately dismantled the police state in Russia, whereas Putin, you're right, there were a lot of illusions about Putin when he took power in 2000. George W. Bush claimed to look in his eyes and find that he was a good Christian, and Obama and Clinton wanted to do a reset with Putin. And one of the few people, by the way, who was clear-eyed about Putin was John McCain, who I'm writing a biography of right now, who famously said, "I looked in his eyes and I saw a K, a G, and a B," and he was absolutely right. But I don't think anybody can have any illusions about Putin now, because he's kind of gone in the opposite direction of Gorbachev. Gorbachev dismantled the police state. Putin has put it back together. Gorbachev ended cross-border aggression against Afghanistan. Putin has launched a new and even more horrific war against Ukraine, which he shows no signs of ending. So that's why I think his image is so poor in the West, with everybody seemingly except President Trump, who seems to get giddy every time he gets to meet with or chat with Putin.
You've written about Trump's skepticism in NATO and his sort of good luck to all posture towards allies under threat. If Reagan were watching the current NATO debate and the Poland-Baltic incidents you've covered, where do you think he would land? And would there be any part of today's Republican critique he might actually share?
I think Ronald Reagan was always a staunch supporter of NATO. I mean, I think I would encourage people to go back and listen to or read his 1984 D-Day address, what became known as the Boys of Pontefract speech, largely remembered today because he paid this moving tribute to the Rangers who stormed the cliffs of D-Day at Pontefract, where he was speaking in 1984. It was a very moving scene, but if you actually listen to or read the rest of the speech, it was a tribute to transatlantic unity and talking about how the Europeans could always count on Americans to be there for them in the future, and that we had to stand side by side with our European allies in defeating aggression. And because remember, Ronald Reagan was a part of the greatest generation, even though he didn't fight in World War II. He was very much of the same mindset. He saw just a very different mindset because remember, he graduated from college in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression. And he saw the damage that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs did in exacerbating the Great Depression. So he was always, even though his political views shifted dramatically later in life, where he went from being a liberal New Deal Democrat to being a conservative Republican, he remained a free trader. Those views remained the same. And he also remained somebody very much dedicated to American international leadership, to America's security alliances. So although in domestic policy, his outlook shifted dramatically, in terms of foreign policy, he very much remained in some ways of the same mindset as his boyhood hero, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that was, that became the dominant theme of the post-war Republican Party, especially in 1952, when Dwight D. Eisenhower defeated Robert Taft for the Republican presidential nomination. And a lot of the reason why Ike was running was because he was afraid that Taft would drag the Republicans back to the America First isolationism of the 1930s. He didn't want that to happen. And so Eisenhower basically set the Republican Party on this path of rejecting the 1930s isolationism, embracing internationalism, embracing NATO and other alliances, embracing free trade. And now you've basically seen that historical trajectory run its course, because Trump is taking us back to America First, literally, because he has adopted the same name for his foreign policy that Charles Lindbergh used before World War II.
I want to shift a bit to a couple of other items: trade, China, economic nationalism. You've written that China's winning the trade war that Trump started. I don't know if George, who helped write a lot of our trade policies in the Trump administration, would agree, but you describe a very transactional, tariff-heavy strategy. How does that compare, to tie it back to Reagan, with his mix of free trade rhetoric and sort of the selective protectionism? And what would a genuinely Reaganite China policy look like in contrast to Trump's approach today?
Reagan obviously had a very different outlook on trade than Trump does, and the government of Ontario reminded us of that when they paid for that commercial that quoted Ronald Reagan's own words talking about why he was such a passionate free trader and did not believe in tariffs. And of course, Donald Trump, who has a picture of Reagan in the Oval Office, had conniptions over that, and slapped more tariffs on Canada to punish them for having the effrontery to remind us of what Ronald Reagan believed. But that was, again, as I said, Reagan was a child of the Great Depression. He saw the impact of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, so he was always, as he said, a very emotional free trader who sometimes, admittedly, had to make compromises with protectionists in Congress, but he always tried to minimize tariffs. And so, for example, instead of letting Congress impose these massive tariffs on Japanese automobiles, he got the Japanese to impose, quote-unquote, voluntary export restraints to limit the number of Japanese cars coming to the United States. But he fundamentally believed in free trade. And remember, NAFTA is his idea. It started off with his idea. He talked in 1980, in the 1980 campaign, when his slogan, ironically, was Make America Great Again. But one of the ways he wanted to do that was by creating a free trade zone between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. He wanted complete freedom of goods and peoples moving across North America. And he negotiated the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which led ultimately to NAFTA, which Trump subsequently called, the worst treaty ever. So he definitely would not be on board with Trump's, Trump saying that his favorite word in the English language is tariffs, and claiming that, imposing tariffs is going to usher in this new golden age. Now, in terms of U.S. dealings with China, that's a little bit harder to extrapolate from Reagan's record because, of course, in the 1980s, China was not a significant player in the world. It was a country that the U.S. did some business with and worked with against the Soviet Union, but it was just not a major factor in the world. And so I would not presume to speak for how Ronald Reagan would address the China threat today, but I do, from what I see, I don't think Trump has an effective response because, he threatens to impose these massive tariffs on China, like 120%, whatever, going to bring U.S.-China trade to a standstill, which then reverberates in the U.S. stock market as people worried about a recession. And then ultimately Xi Jinping, who turns out to be a much wilier and more cunning geopolitical player than Trump, starts turning the screws on the U.S. by withholding rare earth minerals that we need for our production lines, for defense goods, for cars, for almost everything that we manufacture. And Trump is staring disaster in the face, and then he has to basically back down and lower tariffs on China to the level where they are today. And the Chinese economy is still doing great, and there's just been no indication that China is changing any of its kind of predatory behavior that we object to, whether it's hacking U.S. government websites or private businesses, or flooding the world with cheap subsidized goods or intellectual property theft. It's not really reforming anything. Basically, Trump and Xi Jinping have reached kind of a ceasefire in their trade war, where I think Trump finally figured out that it would be too painful to continue it, and including to his own supporters. Like, soybean farmers were getting whacked because China stopped buying U.S. soybeans, and then Trump comes along and he has to offer like a massive subsidy program to soybean farmers, and then he claims it's a huge victory that China is buying soybeans. But they were buying soybeans before his trade war. They're not buying more soybeans than they were before the trade war. So I really am at a loss to see what the trade war has accomplished. And meanwhile, he is being very lenient in terms of export controls, which is something where I think we do need to be fairly strict. And Reagan was pretty strict with export controls when it came to the Soviet Union. But Trump just let NVIDIA, sell more advanced AI chips to China, which has a lot of the China hawks in the Republican Party horrified. But Trump is clearly not focused on the national security threat from China. He views it primarily as an economic threat, but also as a potential business and economic partner. So I think that's kind of, I think he's got kind of this businessman's outlook, but again, very different from what a lot of other folks in the Republican Party, or for that matter, the Democrat Party, think about in terms of how we should deal with China.
My critique of Trump is that I doubt he has a philosophy when it comes to international affairs. I think it's whack-a-mole, and it's what's in his mind that day. Reagan is, we've already spoken about this clarity thing. He had clarity. He wanted free markets, capitalism, and to defeat the Soviets. Do you have the sense that Trump has any overriding philosophy in handling international affairs right now?
I think it's very transactional, as you suggested. I don't think he has a lot of principles. To the extent that he has principles, they're kind of the opposite of Ronald Reagan's, because Reagan, believed in supporting democracies and opposing dictatorships, whereas Trump seems intrinsically hostile to democracies and supportive of dictatorships. But I think what he actually does is based on kind of the spur of the moment, and it's very hard, to predict where he's going to end up. I mean, for example, right now he's drawing us closer into a regime change operation in Venezuela, which is, very hard to figure out why he's doing that. Because, if George W. Bush had been doing it, you could say, okay, he's a believer in democracy. He wants to export democracy, but clearly Trump doesn't even like democracy. He's undermining democracy at home. He's certainly not going to be exporting it abroad. So what is he up to? I mean, his justification is it's the war on drugs, but he just pardoned the president of Honduras, who was in prison for 45 years on charges very similar to those that are being leveled against Maduro in Venezuela. The president of Honduras facilitated hundreds of pounds of cocaine entering the United States, and Trump just pardoned him. And now he's going to supposedly try to topple Maduro because Maduro is implicated in drug dealing. It really doesn't add up. It feels like there's some other agenda there, but it's hard to know what it actually is. And so there is a huge lack of consistency in Trump's foreign policy, because one day he calls himself the peace president and brags about all the peace treaties he's achieved, vastly exaggerated, and then the next day, he's making these war threats against Venezuela and saber rattling and engaging in gunboat diplomacy and blowing up speedboats that he accuses of smuggling drugs without any kind of due process rights and without any legal justification. So I actually wrote a column about this, basically saying that Trump's foreign policy defies description. I mean, you can try to impose a logical or ideological framework on it from the outside, but it's inherently artificial, because he himself he just does whatever he feels like, and it varies based on the day and on the circumstances.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. I mean, again, when I look at the history of the 1980s and how President Reagan was treated as a kind of outsider to the Republican establishment, a fool, a graduate of Eureka College, whereas others, had graduated from Yale and were, central to the establishment of the party. I'm just struck by how there seems to be sometimes a bit of historical amnesia about who President Reagan was and the axis between his deeply populist movement and the policies that he pursued. The idea that we would see a divergence from President Trump's understanding of the Western Hemisphere and President Reagan's, when the man was known, became nationally famous for floating the idea of taking back the Panama Canal. I think there's this tragic misunderstanding that the American people tend to favor realism in their foreign policy. And when they vote on the issue, they elect someone like President Trump, who is despised by those who dislike the concept the United States might behave not according to ideological principles or how countries operate within their own borders, but necessarily according to the interests of the United States. President Trump was elected despite being disliked by almost every elite in the country, and how he represents the end of American democracy or the decline of our republic is just beyond me. I will say, however, that, I just on the economic point that in terms of an economic war that's being launched, I feel like Reagan sort of wrote the script. But rather than going after China's energy imports, as Reagan did Russia's energy imports, President Trump is going after the Chinese production of low-value goods, which satiate the world market. And he's making it much more difficult for them to do business in an area that they've subsidized. But from May 1982 onward, it seemed like every year President Reagan came up with new economic sanctions, not tariffs, but sanctions on Soviet energy exports. And I think that it's a valuable kind of historical linkage between the two presidencies. But, I don't mean to go on a diatribe. I thought I'd offer those thoughts.
Reagan was much more inconsistent than what you're suggesting, because he did try to, for example, impose sanctions, export controls to prevent the construction of the Trans-Siberian oil and gas pipeline, which the Soviets were building, which he saw as a boost for the communist system. But our European allies did not want to go along with that, because they were hoping to get cheap oil and gas from the Soviet Union. And they accused the U.S. of hypocrisy, because one of the first things that Reagan did upon taking office was to lift the wheat embargo on U.S. exports of wheat to the Soviet Union imposed by Carter after the invasion of Afghanistan. But what Reagan decided to do was to basically, at the urging of George Shultz, the Secretary of State, he backed off the strong unilateral U.S. sanctions on the Trans-Siberian gas pipeline, because he valued relations with our European allies above all, and he wanted to keep a united front in NATO. So I don't think Reagan was necessarily all that consistent in his approach, and Trump definitely is not consistent in his approach. And by the way, Chinese exports are booming. They're not being really hurt in any way that I can see by the trade war that Trump launched. They're still exporting a lot of stuff to the U.S., but also to a lot of other countries. And so I just don't see much evidence that Trump is achieving very much with his trade wars.
As many people would consider you a never Trumper. Trump is, of course, going to be out of office in 3 years, which seems like a lifetime.
Knock on wood.
Do you think that the Republican Party will return to where you are when he's gone? Or do you think that basically it's going to be stuck where it is for the foreseeable future?
I think it's more likely it's going to be stuck where it is, because the likely standard bearer of the Republican Party in 2028, assuming Trump doesn't figure out a way to run for a third term, the likely standard bearer is going to be J.D. Vance, who has gone from denouncing Trump as another Hitler to being Trump's vice president, kind of symbolizing the transformation of the Republican Party from a party where most of the folks abhorred Trump to one where most of the folks embraced Trump. And I think that's probably where the Republican Party will be. We'll see, long-term parties change over the years, but I don't see any immediate change in the Republican Party because I think Trump has dominated it so thoroughly. So it's hard to find a lot of traces of the old Republican Party, although they they rise up occasionally among some of the old timers, for example, in the Senate, like Mitch McConnell and a few others who are appalled at Trump's willingness to abandon Ukraine, for example. But that seems like very much a minority impulse, although, maybe it is possible things will change because Trump right now is around 40% approval. You saw Indiana Republicans bucking Trump on redistricting. Maybe as we get closer to 2028, and if his approval rating stays as low as it is, if Republicans suffer a massive repudiation in the midterm elections, which is certainly possible, you may see the Republican Party start to distance itself a little bit more from Trump than it's been willing to do to date.
George, unless you have anything, I want to thank you, Max, for taking the time. For our listeners, where can they find your work, both your books and your articles? Where are you today?
Well, I write a weekly column for the Washington Post. I write books. You can find out more at www.maxboot.net, which is my website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining, and let's be sure to do it again soon. Thanks again for listening to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to subscribe and share with your friends.